39,000 feet above the flat, endless fields below, the cabin of Skyward Flight 217 still looked normal. People were sipping soda. A kid was tapping a game on a tablet. A man in a suit was half asleep with his mouth open. But up front, something unthinkable had already happened. Behind the cockpit door, both pilots were down. Not tired. Not stressed. Not, give them a minute, down. Unconscious. And the plane was still flying, steady, smooth, almost peaceful, because the autopilot was doing its job. For now. In the forward galley, the lead flight attendant, Darren Holt, stared at the warning light on his panel like it was a bad joke. It wasn't a normal call button. It wasn't the "coffee, please" chime. It was the emergency signal, only used when the cockpit needs help immediately. Darren swallowed hard, keyed the crew code, and pushed the door open. His brain refused to accept what his eyes saw. Captain slumped forward in his harness. First officer collapsed sideways, her head tilted like a puppet whose strings had been cut. A quiet, deadly silence filled the cockpit, except for the soft hum of the jet eating up miles of sky. Darren rushed in, shaking the captain's shoulder. "Sir, Captain. Can you hear me?" "Nothing." He checked the first officer. Nothing again. His hands started moving on instinct, training, muscle memory, pure panic held behind a professional face. He grabbed the emergency oxygen bottle, shoved the mask over the captain's face, then the first officer's. Still no response. His radio handset sat right there, but who was he supposed to talk to? What was he supposed to say? "Hello, this is your flight attendant. Our pilots are unconscious. Please advise." He stumbled back into the galley and hit the intercom with a trembling thumb. Code blue. Cockpit. Both pilots. The words landed like a bomb. Flight attendants snapped into motion. One grabbed the medical kit. One ran to search for doctors. Another fought back tears while preparing to do the one thing flight crew never want to do. Make the announcement. In the cabin, the senior attendant's voice came through the speakers, steady, controlled, but you could hear the fear trying to break through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious medical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. We need to know right now if anyone on board has flight experience, commercial, military, or any professional aircraft training." For one frozen second, the cabin went quiet. Then reality hit. A woman started praying out loud. Someone yelled, "What do you mean both pilots?" A man began calling his wife with shaking hands. A child started crying because his mother was crying. People looked around wildly, like the solution might be sitting in the next row. But no one stood up. Not a pilot. Not a trained aviator. Not anyone who could actually land a wide-body jet. And while hundreds of passengers were realizing they might not see the ground alive. In the middle of economy, seat 14B, a small girl with a tight ponytail and worn sneakers slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Her name was Lia Carter. She was 11 years old. She looked like the last person on earth who could help. But her eyes weren't panicked. They were calculating. Like she had been waiting for a moment she never wanted to come. She stepped into the aisle and started walking forward through the chaos, quiet, focused, moving like she had a mission. A flight attendant reached for her gently. "Honey, please, go back to your seat." Lia didn't stop. "I need to get to the cockpit," she said, voice low but firm. The attendant blinked. "Sweetheart, nobody goes in there." Lia lifted her chin. "Both pilots are unconscious," she said. "Autopilot can't land this plane." The attendant's face went pale. "How would you?" Lia's next words came out like a key turning in a lock. "My mother's call sign was Ghost Rider." The air around them shifted. Even through the noise, even through the crying, even through the panic, something about those words felt wrong. Because everyone in the military aviation world knew that name. And everyone knew the truth. Ghost Rider died 5 years ago. A funeral was held. A name was carved into stone. A legacy was buried. Yet here was a child, walking toward the cockpit like she belonged there, bringing that call sign back from the grave. And when she reached the cockpit radio moments later, she would say 2 words that made nearby F-22 pilots freeze mid-flight. Not because they were scared. Because they were stunned. Because, for them, it would feel like hearing a ghost speak. Before we go any further, comment below where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because what this dead girl did next saved hundreds of lives and exposed a secret the Air Force tried to bury. Before we go back to that cockpit, before the fighters changed course, before a dead call sign echoed across military radio frequencies, you need to understand one thing. Lia Carter was never supposed to be alive. 5 years earlier, her name had been read at a memorial ceremony. A folded flag had been handed to a grieving officer. Her name had been engraved beneath her mother's. Official records listed her as deceased. Case closed. End of story. Except it wasn't. This isn't just a story about a plane losing its pilots at 39,000 feet. It's about a secret kept for 5 years. It's about a legendary fighter pilot whose enemies may have wanted her silenced. It's about a retired colonel who chose to hide a child from the world. And it's about what happens when preparation meets the exact moment it was meant for. Because Lia wasn't some random kid guessing in the cockpit. She wasn't playing flight simulator games for fun. For 5 years, she had been trained in silence. Disciplined. Tested. Pushed. All for a future no one believed would ever come. And now, hundreds of lives were hanging in the sky, balanced between autopilot and disaster. The cabin didn't know it yet. Air traffic control didn't know it yet. Even the Air Force didn't know it yet. But in seat 14B sat the only person on that aircraft who understood exactly what needed to be done. The only person who knew the systems. The only person who knew the procedures. The only person who had been taught how to think like a pilot under pressure. An 11-year-old girl. But how did she learn something like that? How does a child go from being declared dead to being the last hope at cruising altitude? To understand that, we have to rewind. Back to before the emergency announcement. Back to before panic filled the cabin. Back to when Flight 217 was just another routine afternoon departure under clear blue skies. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary moments begin in the most ordinary way. 2 hours earlier, everything felt normal. Skyward Flight 217 pushed back from the gate in San Diego under bright afternoon sunlight. Clear skies. Light wind. Smooth departure. Just another routine cross-country flight heading toward the East Coast. In seat 14B, middle of economy, sat a girl who looked smaller than her age. Lia Carter. 11 years old. Her sneakers were slightly worn. Her hoodie was clean but clearly not new. Her dark hair was tied into a simple ponytail. Nothing about her stood out. At her feet rested a faded blue backpack. Inside that backpack was everything she owned. 3 changes of clothes. A folded photograph of a woman in a flight suit, standing proudly beside an F-22 Raptor. And a small wooden urn, carefully wrapped in a scarf. The businessman in 14C barely noticed her. He was buried in emails, headphones on, living in a world of spreadsheets and deadlines. The woman by the window gave Lia a gentle smile. Traveling alone, sweetheart? Lia nodded politely. Yes, ma'am. Visiting family. The lie came easily. She had been practicing it for 5 years. Because for 5 years, Lia Carter had not officially existed. 5 years ago, the world believed she had died in a mountain crash alongside her mother, Captain Lia Carter, call sign, Ghost Rider. The Air Force held a ceremony. 2 names were read. 2 flags were folded. 2 lives were considered lost. But only 1 body was recovered. Lia survived. Barely. She was found days later by a man who had once flown beside her mother, retired Colonel Owen Hart. He should have reported her survival immediately. He didn't. Instead, he made a decision that would shape the next 5 years of her life. He told the world she had died. And then he took her somewhere no one would think to look. A small property in the mountains. A quiet workshop behind a weathered barn. A place where secrets could stay buried. At first, Lia didn't understand why she had to disappear. She didn't understand why she had to use a different name, Nora Blake. She didn't understand why Colonel Hart would scan the tree line at night like someone might be watching. But one evening, when she was 7, he finally told her the truth. "Your mother's crash wasn't an accident," he said quietly. She remembered the way his jaw tightened when he said it. She was too skilled. That aircraft was inspected twice before takeoff. Something failed that shouldn't have. And the investigation was sealed faster than I've ever seen. Lia had stared at him, confused. Who would want to hurt her? Anyone who feared her, he replied. Your mother embarrassed powerful people. Foreign pilots dreaded seeing her on radar. She outflew jets that should have beaten her. She broke expectations. He knelt in front of her. If someone believed she left behind something valuable, they might come looking. You mean me? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, the training began. At first it was simple, understanding aircraft parts. Watching videos. Reading manuals far above her grade level. Then came the simulator. Colonel Hart built it piece by piece inside his workshop. Salvaged screens. Real throttle assemblies. A modified control yoke sized for her smaller hands. He didn't treat it like a game. Neither did she. He drilled her in procedures. Checklist discipline. Emergency protocols. Radio phraseology. He would shut off engines mid-simulation. Introduce system failures without warning. Simulate smoke in cockpit scenarios. At 8 years old, Lia could identify most commercial aircraft systems better than many adults. At 9, she could talk through an engine fire procedure without looking at notes. At 10, she could fly full approaches in the simulator, steady hands, calm voice. But it wasn't just about controls. It was about mindset. Flying isn't about ego, Colonel Hart would say. It's about responsibility. You don't get emotional at 30,000 feet. You get precise. Sometimes she would get frustrated. Why are you teaching me this if I'm supposed to stay hidden forever? He would pause. Then answer carefully. Because knowledge is protection. And because your mother died trying to teach you to love the sky. He would hand her the photo of Lia Carter, standing beside an F-22, helmet under her arm, confident smile barely visible. She was Ghost Rider, he would say softly. One of the best fighter pilots I've ever seen. That legacy shouldn't disappear because someone tried to erase it. 5 years passed that way. Quiet. Hidden. Disciplined. Until 2 months ago. Cancer. Colonel Hart weakened fast, but his mind stayed sharp until the end. In his final week, he made her promise something. If you ever face a moment where lives depend on what I taught you, don't hesitate, he whispered. Don't let your age scare you. Don't let being declared dead scare you. If it's necessary, act. She squeezed his hand. I'm just a kid. He managed a faint smile. So was every pilot once. Now, on Flight 217, Lia was traveling under her real name for the first time in 5 years. The legal process of correcting her identity had just begun. Colonel Hart's ashes rested in her backpack. She was heading to Washington to fulfill his final wish. The engines roared during takeoff. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky. As the wheels retracted, Lia closed her eyes. Not in fear. In habit. She mentally ran through the aircraft systems. Twin engines. Fly-by-wire controls. Hydraulic redundancy. Cruise altitude expected around 39,000 feet. Estimated rotation speed near 160 knots. Her fingers twitched slightly against the armrest, mimicking throttle adjustments. The businessman next to her never noticed. The woman by the window never guessed. To them, she was just a quiet child flying alone. But inside her mind was 5 years of training. 5 years of discipline. 5 years of preparation for something she never expected to use. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and calm. And somewhere far below, in the mountains she had never returned to, lay the crash site where the world believed she died. For 5 years, she had lived like a ghost. And in less than an hour, that ghost would have to fly. At 3:46 p.m., everything was still smooth. The cabin lights were dimmed slightly. Drinks had been served. Most passengers had settled into that quiet, floating rhythm of long-haul flight. At 39,000 feet, skyward Flight 217 was cutting through clear air like a knife through silk. Inside the cockpit, Captain Ryan Mitchell adjusted his headset slightly and glanced at the navigation display. "Nice and easy day," he muttered. First Officer Dana Brooks nodded. "Wish they were all like this." Neither of them noticed the faint, invisible danger slipping into the cockpit air. Carbon monoxide has no smell. No warning. No color. Just silence. Captain Mitchell blinked hard. The instrument panel seemed slightly blurred. He shook his head once. "Dana, you feel that?" "Feel what?" "Little light-headed." She frowned. "Maybe dehydration." He reached for his water bottle but missed it slightly. That's when Dana felt it too. A strange heaviness. Like her limbs were filled with sand. The captain rubbed his temples. Something's off. He scanned the overhead panel out of habit, but his vision tunneled. Dana reached for the radio to call it in, but her fingers felt disconnected from her brain. The aircraft continued straight and level. Autopilot engaged. Systems green. Cruise stable. The jet had no idea its pilots were fading. "Ryan," Dana whispered. He didn't answer. He slumped forward against his harness. Dana's heart pounded in confusion and fear. She managed to hit the emergency cockpit alert switch, a small foot-triggered signal meant for moments exactly like this. Then the darkness took her too. And just like that. At nearly 40,000 feet in open sky. There was no one flying the plane. In the cabin, nothing changed for nearly 60 seconds. A baby laughed in row 22. Someone ordered coffee. A teenager scrolled through videos. Normal. Ordinary. Safe. Until Darren Holt saw the red cockpit alert flashing on his control panel. Not a standard call. Not a request for water. The emergency override signal. His stomach dropped. He entered the cockpit and found both pilots unconscious. Training took over. Check pulse. Check breathing. Administer oxygen. Call for help. The rest of the crew moved fast. One flight attendant ran through the cabin asking for medical professionals. Another retrieved the emergency medical kit. Darren grabbed the satellite phone and connected to air traffic control. Kansas Center, this is Skyward 217 cabin crew. We have a full pilot incapacitation situation. Both flight crew unresponsive. The controller's voice sharpened instantly. Say again. Both pilots are down. The words hung in the air like thunder. Inside the cabin, the announcement followed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. If anyone on board has professional flight experience, please identify yourself immediately. This time, panic wasn't delayed. It exploded. Gasps turned to cries. Phones came out. People began whispering the word no one wanted to say out loud. Crash. A retired aircraft mechanic stood up. I worked maintenance, he said, shaking. Never flew. A college student raised his hand halfway. I play flight simulators. Not enough. Not even close. The realization spread row by row. There was no pilot on board. Not one. The jet continued cruising on autopilot, steady and calm, a machine doing exactly what it was programmed to do. But autopilot doesn't make decisions. It doesn't avoid fuel exhaustion. It doesn't perform emergency descents around unpredictable weather. And it doesn't land safely without trained hands guiding it. In seat 14B, Lia's heart hammered. Her mind was already moving. Carbon monoxide. Cockpit environment system. Dual incapacitation. She had trained this scenario before. Colonel Hart used to trigger it randomly during simulation. He would say, "You walk in and both pilots are down. What do you do first?" She could hear his voice now like he was sitting beside her. Secure aircraft. Assess altitude. Confirm autopilot mode. Establish communication. She felt the weight of the backpack at her feet. Inside it, the ashes of the man who had prepared her for this exact nightmare. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a simulator. This wasn't a lesson. This was real. Real altitude. Real engines. Real lives. 312 people. And she was 11 years old. If she stood up, everything would change. Her identity would be exposed. Questions would flood in. Investigations. Media. Military. The quiet life Colonel Hart built would vanish overnight. But if she stayed seated, the aircraft would eventually run out of solutions. Her mother's final lesson echoed in her mind. If lives depend on it, act. In the galley, Darren was speaking urgently into the phone. They're clearing airspace. Fighters may be scrambled as precaution. But unless someone can physically take control. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Lia closed her eyes. She pictured the simulator. The throttle levers. The trim wheel. The feel of flare during landing. She remembered the first time Colonel Hart killed both simulated pilots mid-flight. Her small hands had shaken. He had placed his hand over hers and said, "Calm is a choice." She opened her eyes. The panic around her was growing louder. A woman in the row ahead was crying into her phone. The businessman beside her whispered, "This can't be real." But it was real. The autopilot was holding steady. For now. And somewhere far above the Midwest skies, two F-22 Raptors were finishing a routine patrol. They had no idea that in minutes they would hear a voice that should not exist. Lia slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. The sound of the click felt louder than the chaos around her. This was the moment. Not the landing. Not the radio call. Not the headlines. This. The decision. And she stood up. The moment Lia stood up, the cabin felt smaller. Not physically. But emotionally. Fear has a way of shrinking space. People were crying openly now. A man across the aisle was whispering prayers under his breath. A mother was clutching her son so tightly he could barely move. Darren Holt rushed back from the cockpit, face pale but controlled. "We need to know if anyone here has actual flight certification," he repeated loudly. "Commercial, military, anything." Silence. The kind that hurts your ears. 300 people. Not one pilot. The aircraft continued forward at nearly 500 miles per hour, smooth and steady, the engines humming like nothing was wrong. But inside the cockpit, both pilots were still unconscious, oxygen masks secured, no improvement. Air traffic control had cleared the skies around them. Emergency services were already preparing at multiple airports. But preparation doesn't land an airplane. Hands do. Lia stepped into the aisle. A flight attendant reached for her gently. "Honey, please sit down. It's not safe to stand." Lia looked up at her, calm in a way that didn't match her age. "Autopilot is holding altitude," she said quietly. "But if it needs rerouting or descent adjustments, someone has to input it manually." The attendant blinked. "How do you know that?" Lia didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she asked one. "What altitude are we at?" The attendant hesitated. I think 39,000 feet. Lia nodded slightly. "Cruise. Stable." But time was ticking. Darren approached them both. "What's going on?" The attendant whispered urgently, "She says she understands the systems." Darren looked down at the tiny girl standing in the aisle. "This isn't the time for imagination," he said, not unkindly. "We need a real pilot." "My mother was one," Lia replied. Something in her tone made him pause. She was Captain Lia Carter. F-22 pilot. Call sign Ghost Rider. Darren's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. That name meant nothing to most civilians. But it meant something to someone else on that radio frequency. Still, he shook his head. "That doesn't make you a pilot." "No," Lia agreed softly. "But I've trained in a full cockpit simulator for 5 years. I know emergency descent procedures. I know checklist order. I know how to manage a glide slope and flare." Her words weren't dramatic. They were technical. Precise. She wasn't bragging. She was stating. Darren stared at her. 5 years, he asked carefully. "My guardian trained me," she said. "He was a colonel. He flew combat missions. He made sure I understood everything." The panic in the cabin was getting louder. A man shouted from the back, "Are we going down or not?" Darren ran a hand over his face. He had seconds to decide. No certified pilot had stepped forward. The autopilot would eventually need human input. And this child, this 11-year-old, was the only person speaking in technical language instead of fear. He leaned down closer to her. "If I bring you to that cockpit and this is some kind of mistake." "It's not," she said. There was no arrogance in her voice. Just certainty. Behind them, another flight attendant rushed up. "The captain still hasn't responded. Oxygen isn't helping." Darren exhaled slowly. This was the kind of decision that could end careers. Or save lives. He looked at Lia one more time. "What's your name?" "Lia Carter." And then, after a small pause. "I was declared dead 5 years ago." Darren stared at her. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." There was no time to unpack that. He made the call. "All right. You're coming with me." The flight attendants exchanged looks of disbelief as Lia followed him down the aisle toward the cockpit. Passengers watched in stunned silence. A child? A child was their last option. Inside the cockpit, the air felt heavy. The 2 pilots were strapped in place but completely unresponsive. Instruments glowed. Displays showed perfect cruise data. The plane was flying itself, but it wasn't thinking. Darren and another attendant carefully moved the first officer from the right seat. They laid her gently behind the cockpit area so emergency-trained passengers could monitor her. The captain remained slumped in the left seat. Lia stepped forward. The chair looked enormous. The controls looked bigger than her arms. For one heartbeat, reality hit her. This wasn't plywood and computer screens in a mountain workshop. This was 200 tons of aircraft. 300 souls. And no reset button. She climbed into the captain's seat. Even with it adjusted forward, her feet barely touched the rudder pedals. Her hands rested on the yoke. She inhaled slowly. Scan instruments. Altitude stable. Airspeed steady. Autopilot engaged. Fuel levels healthy. Weather clear ahead. It was exactly as she imagined. Exactly as she feared. Darren handed her the headset. Air traffic control needs to know who's flying, he said quietly. Her hand hovered over the radio switch. This was the line she could never uncross. The moment the world would know she was alive. The moment the ghost would speak. She pressed the transmit button. Kansas Center, this is Skyward 217. Her voice sounded smaller through the headset than it felt inside her. Both pilots are incapacitated. I am assuming control of the aircraft. There was a sharp pause on the other end. Skyward 217, confirm identity of acting pilot. Her throat tightened. For 5 years, she had stayed silent. Hidden. Forgotten. Now the sky was listening. She swallowed. And spoke the words that would freeze fighter pilots mid-flight. This is Ghost Rider. The radio went silent. Not static. Not confusion. Silence. The kind that happens when something impossible just entered reality. Kansas Center to Skyward 217, say again your call sign. Lia's fingers tightened slightly around the yoke. Ghost Rider, she repeated, voice steady this time. My mother was Captain Lia Carter. F-22 pilot. She died 5 years ago in a crash. I was declared dead with her. But I survived. The controller didn't respond immediately. Somewhere in a dark radar room, people were staring at each other. Because Ghost Rider wasn't just a pilot. Ghost Rider was a legend. And legends don't answer radios. Then another voice broke in. It wasn't civilian. It was sharp. Military. Controlled. Kansas Center, this is Viper flight on routine patrol. Did we just hear the call sign Ghost Rider transmitted? The frequency shifted. The air itself seemed to tighten. Affirmative, Viper, the controller replied carefully. Transmission confirmed. A second fighter pilot's voice cut in, deeper, rougher. This is Rook 2. Ghost Rider went down 5 years ago. That call sign was retired. Who is transmitting? In the cockpit, Lia's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. She pressed the mic again. Rook 2, is that Major Daniel Reyes? There was a pause. A long one. Yes, came the answer. Slower now. Cautious. I met you when I was 6, Lia said. You brought a model jet to our house. You and my mom argued about who made the better landings. Silence again. Then. Lia. Her breath caught. Yes, sir. In the back seat of his F-22, Major Reyes felt the world tilt. He remembered that house. He remembered the little girl who had run around the backyard with a toy plane shouting, "Watch me go supersonic." He remembered standing at a memorial service staring at 2 engraved names. You were listed as deceased, he said quietly. I know. In the cockpit of Flight 217, Darren and the crew stared at Lia like she was no longer just a child. She was something else now. A missing chapter. A living secret. Rook 2 exhaled slowly over the radio. Center, Viper flight is requesting immediate vector to intercept Skyward 217. Approved, the controller responded instantly. Airspace clearing in progress. 2 F-22 Raptors banked hard in the sky. Afterburners ignited. They accelerated like arrows released from a bow. Back in the cockpit, Lia refocused. Emotion could wait. Procedure couldn't. Kansas Center, I need nearest suitable airport, current weather, and descent clearance, she said, her tone shifting into technical calm. The controller responded with urgency. Nearest is Midland International, 118 miles east. Clear skies, light winds. Emergency services mobilizing. Maintain current heading. Roger. Rook 2's voice returned, closer now, steadier. Lia, listen to me carefully. We're coming up on your left side. You're not alone. I understand. You remember your mother's descent profile? Yes, sir. Controlled descent. 1,500 feet per minute. Stabilize at each altitude. That's right. Keep it smooth. No sudden moves. Moments later, two sleek gray shapes appeared outside the cockpit windows. F-22 Raptors. Perfect formation. Guardians in the sky. Passengers in the cabin began pointing through the windows. Are those fighter jets? They're escorting us. A ripple of strange hope passed through the chaos. In the cockpit, Lia disengaged altitude hold. The aircraft responded gently as she began the descent. Her hands were small. But they were precise. Airspeed steady. Vertical speed controlled. Rook 2 stayed with her every step. Watch your pitch. Don't chase the numbers. Let the aircraft settle. I see it, she replied. Her voice sounded older than 11. Behind her, Darren watched in disbelief. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't panicking. She was working. Gear check later, Rook 2 continued. Right now focus on energy management. Yes, sir. The jetliner descended through layers of sky, escorted by two of the most advanced fighters ever built. On military frequencies, word was spreading fast. Ghost Rider's daughter is alive. Ghost Rider's daughter is flying a civilian airliner. In the cabin, the senior attendant made another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are being escorted by United States Air Force aircraft. We have someone at the controls who is trained and in communication with military pilots. We are preparing for landing. People began crying for a different reason now. Hope. In the cockpit, Lia felt fear rising in her chest. She whispered under her breath, something Colonel Hart used to say during hard simulations. Calm is a choice. Rook 2 heard her breathing shift. You're doing good, he said quietly. Your mom would be proud of you right now. Her eyes stung, but she didn't let it distract her. Let's just get them home, she replied. The turning point had passed. The ghost had spoken. The sky had answered. Now there was only one thing left to do. Land. Midland International Airport was now a fortress of flashing lights. Fire trucks lined the runway. Ambulances idled near the taxiways. Airport officials stood frozen, staring at radar screens that showed something no one had trained for. A commercial airliner descending. Escorted by two F-22 Raptors. Piloted by an 11-year-old girl. In the cockpit of Flight 217, the ground was finally visible in the distance, a thin gray strip carved into green fields. But distance can be deceiving at 280 knots. All right, Lia, Rook 2 said, voice calm but firm. We're going to transition to approach phase. Reduce speed gradually. Let's bring it down to 250 knots. Reducing, she replied. Her fingers eased the thrust levers back. The engines responded with a subtle change in tone. Airspeed began to drop. Behind her, Darren read from the quick reference handbook with shaking hands. Approach checklist ready. Landing lights on, Lia said. Landing lights on, Darren confirmed. The cabin crew secured the last of the loose items. Passengers were instructed to brace. Some held hands. Some closed their eyes. Some watched the fighters pacing the wings like silent guardians. Outside, Viper flight held tight formation, matching the slower speed of the descending jet, something fighter pilots rarely had to do. Inside Rook 2's cockpit, Daniel Reyes could see her through the window. So small in that massive flight deck. But steady. "Okay, Lia," he said. "At 10,000 feet, slow further. Remember flap sequence. Don't rush it." "Copy." Altitude unwound on the display. 15,000 feet. 12,000. 10,000. Reducing speed to 210 knots. Good. Set flaps 5. She moved the lever. The aircraft responded with a soft mechanical hum as flaps extended. The nose adjusted slightly. She compensated smoothly. "Nice correction," Rook 2 said. But then, airspeed flickered slightly upward. A small overspeed warning blinked. Darren's breath caught. "It's climbing." "I see it," Lia said quickly. Instead of panicking, she adjusted pitch and throttles together. The warning faded. Stability returned. In the cabin, a few passengers felt the subtle shift. A collective gasp rose, then quieted again. "Good catch," Rook 2 murmured. "That's energy management. Stay ahead of it." They were now lined up for final approach. Runway 02L stretched ahead like a lifeline. At 5,000 feet, Midland Tower's voice entered the frequency. "Skyward 217, runway 02L cleared for emergency landing. Winds calm. You are clear all the way in." Clear. All the way in. No pressure, Lia thought. Just 200 tons of aircraft and 312 lives. "Gear down," Rook 2 instructed. Her hand hovered for half a second. Then she moved the lever. The landing gear thudded into position. She watched the panel. 1 green. 2 green. 3 green. Gear down and locked. "Beautiful," Rook 2 said. The runway lights were brighter now. Close enough to feel real. Flaps 15. Set. Flaps 30. Set. The aircraft slowed further. It felt heavier now. More alive. More sensitive. At 1,000 feet, the automated call-out chimed through the cockpit speakers. "Stable," Lia whispered to herself. Her palms were sweating. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She could feel every vibration of the aircraft through the seat. "Remember," Rook 2 said softly, "small movements. Don't chase perfection. Just fly it down." At 500 feet, Darren gripped the back of her seat. Emergency vehicles lined the runway like a corridor of red and blue. At 300 feet, Lia felt the wind nudge the aircraft slightly left. A crosswind. Light, but noticeable. Her stomach tightened. She adjusted gently. The nose realigned. "Good correction," Rook 2 said. "You've got it." At 100 feet. "Prepare to flare," he instructed. The runway rushed toward them. The ground filled the windshield. For a split second, fear tried to take control. This was it. No simulator. No reset. Just physics. She pulled back slightly on the yoke. Not too much. Not too little. The main wheels slammed the runway harder than ideal. A loud thud echoed through the cabin. Gasps. A slight bounce. For half a heartbeat, the plane lifted inches off the runway again. Darren nearly shouted. But Lia reacted instantly. She eased forward pressure. Stabilized. The wheels touched again. This time solid. "Hold it," Rook 2 commanded. She deployed thrust reversers. The engines roared in reverse. The aircraft decelerated hard. She applied brakes steadily, not slamming, not freezing. The massive jet slowed. 180 knots. And then it rolled to a controlled stop. Silence. For 1 second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Midland Tower's voice came through. Skyward 217, you are safely on the ground. In the cockpit, Lia's hands began to shake. Adrenaline finally crashing through her system. Outside, the two F-22 Raptors screamed overhead in a tight vertical climb, a salute usually reserved for fallen pilots. Today, it wasn't for someone lost. It was for someone returned. In the cabin, the silence broke into something else. Crying. Cheering. Prayers of thanks. People hugging strangers. Darren stepped forward slowly. You did it, he whispered, voice cracking. Lia stared out at the runway lights, barely hearing him. She had just done what no one thought possible. She had landed a commercial airliner at 11 years old. But this wasn't the end. The impossible part wasn't just the landing. It was what came after. Because outside that aircraft, the world was already changing. For a few seconds after the aircraft stopped, there was nothing but soundless shock. Then the cabin exploded. People were crying, shouting, laughing through tears. A man dropped to his knees in the aisle. A woman hugged the stranger next to her like they had known each other for years. We're alive. Oh my God, we're alive. In the cockpit, Lia's hands were still gripping the controls. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until Darren gently touched her shoulder. It's over, he said softly. You brought us home. That word hit her harder than the landing. Home. The cockpit door burst open as emergency personnel rushed in. Medics immediately focused on the two unconscious pilots, transferring them to stretchers with practiced urgency. They've got pulses, one medic said. Strong. Let's move. Oxygen masks were replaced with medical equipment. The captain and first officer were carried out quickly toward waiting ambulances. Lia watched silently. She had saved the aircraft. But they still had to survive. Outside, the runway was surrounded by flashing red and blue lights. And above it all, two F-22 Raptors roared past one last time before banking away. A salute. Not for someone fallen. But for a legacy that had just returned. The cockpit steps were rolled up to the aircraft. Darren turned to Lia. You ready to come out there? She hesitated. 5 years hidden. 5 years invisible. 5 years as a ghost. The door opened. Sunlight poured in. And with it, reality. As Lia stepped onto the portable stairs, a wave of cameras flashed below. News crews had already arrived. Airport workers stood frozen. Passengers exiting through the rear doors were pointing forward, whispering. That's her. That's the kid. That's the one who landed it. At the bottom of the stairs stood a tall man in a green flight suit. His helmet was tucked under his arm. His hair streaked with gray. His eyes red. Major Daniel Reyes, call sign Rook 2. He didn't rush her. He didn't smile. He just stood there like he was seeing a ghost. Lia reached the bottom step. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. You look like her, he finally said, voice rough. Lia nodded slightly. I remember you, she whispered. You used to say her landings were too smooth. He laughed, a broken, emotional sound. They were. Then, without hesitation, he dropped to one knee and saluted her. A full military salute. On an airport tarmac. In front of cameras and strangers. For an 11-year-old girl. Welcome back, Ghost Rider, he said quietly. Lia's composure shattered. Tears spilled down her face. She stepped forward and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I thought we lost you," he murmured. "You didn't," she replied softly. "I just wasn't allowed to exist." Behind them, military SUVs rolled onto the tarmac. This wasn't just a miraculous landing anymore. This was a classified situation. A child officially declared dead had just reappeared, on live radar, on open radio frequencies, escorted by Air Force fighters. A woman in a dark blazer stepped forward with calm authority. "Lia Carter?" she asked. Lia turned, still clutching the strap of her backpack. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Colonel Dana Weller, Air Force Special Investigations." Her eyes were sharp but not cold. "We need to talk about what happened 5 years ago." Rook 2 stepped slightly closer to Lia, protective. "She just landed a 777, he said firmly. "Maybe give her a minute." Colonel Weller nodded respectfully. "You're right. But understand something, if she was hidden because of security threats tied to her mother's crash, then this changes everything." Lia tightened her grip on the backpack. Inside it, the ashes of Colonel Owen Hart rested quietly. "He kept me hidden because the crash wasn't an accident," she said softly. "He believed someone sabotaged the aircraft." Colonel Weller's expression shifted, just slightly. "That investigation was sealed," she admitted. "There were suspicions. Nothing proven." "And now?" Rook 2 asked. "Now she's publicly alive," Weller replied. "Which means we reassess everything." Behind them, passengers were being interviewed. One woman clutched her phone and sobbed into it. "A little girl landed the plane," she said. "She saved my children." Another passenger pointed toward Lia. "She wasn't scared," he told a reporter. "She was calm. Like she had done it before." In a way, she had. The medics approached Rook 2. "The pilots will recover," one said. "Carbon monoxide exposure." They were lucky. Lucky. 312 people were lucky. But it hadn't been luck. It had been preparation. Courage. And a decision made in one quiet aisle at 39,000 feet. Colonel Weller looked back at Lia. "You're going to have questions to answer," she said. "About who trained you. About how you stayed hidden." Lia nodded. "I'll answer them." "And after that?" Lia looked up at the sky, clear and endless above the runway. "After that," she said softly, "I'd like to scatter my guardian's ashes at the memorial like he asked." Rook 2 felt his throat tighten. "He deserves that," he said. Colonel Weller gave a small nod. "We'll make arrangements." Around them, the media storm grew louder. But in the middle of it all stood a girl who had once been erased. Now the world knew she was alive. And not just alive. She was the daughter of Ghost Rider. And she had just written her own chapter in the sky. The headlines hit before the sun went down. Girl declared dead, lands passenger jet. Ghost Rider's daughter returns. 11-year-old saves 312 lives. News helicopters hovered over Midland International long after the aircraft had been towed away. Social media flooded with blurry photos of a small girl stepping out of a cockpit too big for her. But inside a secured conference room at the airport, the atmosphere was very different. Quiet. Serious. Controlled. Lia sat at the end of a long table, her backpack resting against her leg. Rook 2 sat beside her. Colonel Dana Weller sat across from them with 2 intelligence officers and a legal advisor. This wasn't an interrogation. But it wasn't casual either. "Start from the crash," Colonel Weller said gently. Lia took a breath. She told them everything. The malfunction mid-flight 5 years ago. Her mother's voice telling her to eject. The impact. Waking up alone in the mountains. Being found days later by Colonel Owen Hart. The decision to report her as deceased. The fake identity. The training. The simulator. The lessons. The fear that someone had sabotaged her mother's aircraft. The room stayed silent as she spoke. No one interrupted. When she finished, Colonel Weller folded her hands. Colonel Hart kept records. Yes, ma'am, Lia said. Training logs. Simulator recordings. Journals. His lawyer has them. Within hours, investigators confirmed it. Owen Hart had documented everything, not recklessly, but methodically. He had written about his suspicion that Lia Carter's crash investigation had been quietly sealed to avoid political fallout. He had written about protecting Lia. About preparing her, in case the world ever needed her. He never intended for that moment to happen at 39,000 feet. But he prepared her anyway. Meanwhile, medical reports confirmed the cause of the cockpit emergency. Carbon monoxide leak from a faulty environmental seal. Maintenance error. Not sabotage. The pilots would recover fully. The disaster had not been intentional. But the fear that shaped Lia's hidden life. That fear had been real. DNA testing was fast-tracked. Within 24 hours, it was official. Lia Carter was alive. Legally resurrected. Government databases corrected. Military records amended. Her name removed from the deceased list. But a new problem appeared. She had no living relatives. Colonel Hart had been her legal guardian under the false identity. Now he was gone. Colonel Weller looked across the table. Until a permanent guardianship is arranged, you'll be under temporary federal protection. Rook 2 leaned forward. I'll take her. The room turned toward him. My name is Daniel Reyes. I flew with her mother for 12 years. I stood at her memorial. I should have been there 5 years ago. I won't miss the second chance. Colonel Weller studied him carefully. You understand what that means? Security clearances. Media attention. Possible ongoing investigation. I understand, he said firmly. And I'm not asking for convenience. I'm asking because she belongs with someone who knew her mother. Lia glanced up at him. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with respect. After days of legal review, background checks, and military approvals, the decision was made. Temporary guardianship granted. Lia Carter moved to Virginia. Into the Reyes family home. Rook 2's wife greeted her at the door with open arms. His 2 teenagers were half in awe, half protective, and entirely welcoming. For the first time in 5 years. Lia slept in a house that didn't feel hidden. But the world didn't quiet immediately. For weeks, interviews were requested. Security briefings were conducted. Military officials reassessed the original crash investigation of Lia Carter. Nothing new was uncovered. No smoking gun. But one truth stood clear. Even if someone once tried to erase Ghost Rider's legacy, they had failed. One afternoon, about a month after the landing, Lia stood quietly outside the Air Force Memorial in Arlington. The tall steel spires rose toward the sky like frozen contrails. At the base of one engraved wall was her mother's name. Captain Elena, Ghost Rider, Carter. Lia traced the letters with her fingertips. I made it, she whispered. Rook 2 stood a few feet behind her in full dress uniform. Beside Lia was the small wooden urn. Colonel Owen Hart's ashes. Dozens of Air Force personnel stood nearby, not because they were ordered to. Because they wanted to be. Word had spread. They had come to honor the man who protected Ghost Rider's daughter. Lia knelt and opened the urn. Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. Thank you for saving me. For teaching me. For believing I might need it one day. She scattered the ashes gently at the base of the memorial. A bugler played taps. The notes floated upward into open sky. Rook 2 stepped forward and saluted. Lia followed his example. For 5 years, she had been invisible. Now she stood under the open sky, not as a ghost, but as someone reborn. When the ceremony ended, a senior Air Force general approached her. "Your mother's call sign was retired after her death," he said respectfully. "Out of honor." He held something in his hand. A flight patch. Black background. Silver lettering. Ghost Rider. "We do not give call signs lightly," he continued. "They are earned. They carry weight." He knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "You earn something at 39,000 feet. But this is not a burden. It is an invitation. When you are ready, not today, not tomorrow, this call sign can live again." Lia held the patch carefully. "I'm only 11, she said quietly. The general smiled. "Then you have time." Later that evening, as she sat on the porch of the Reyes home, watching a sunset stretch across the sky, Ruktu joined her. "You did something extraordinary," he said. "I just used what I was taught," she replied. "That's what extraordinary usually is," he said. "Preparation meeting necessity." She looked down at the patch in her hands. "Do you think she'd be proud?" He didn't hesitate. "She'd be proud that you landed the plane," he said. "But she'd be even prouder of who you are becoming." The sky above them deepened into blue. The same sky Lia Carter had once ruled. Lia exhaled slowly. 5 years hidden. 1 day in the cockpit. And now. A future wide open. But this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new one. And this time, she wouldn't be flying in secret. 3 years later, the sky looked different to Lia Carter. Not because it had changed, but because she had. At 14, she was no longer the quiet, hidden girl in seat 14B. She was a student at one of the most competitive youth aviation programs in the country, the youngest ever accepted. The first day she walked into the hangar, conversation stopped. "That's her. The girl from the airliner. Ghost Rider's daughter." She hated that part at first. The staring. The expectations. The pressure to be perfect. Because landing one airplane in an emergency didn't magically make her a pilot. It made her brave. There's a difference. Her first real training flight in a small single-engine aircraft was humbling. She overcorrected on turns. Bounced her first landing. Forgot a radio phrase and had to repeat herself. When they taxied back to the ramp, she stared down at her hands. "They're shaking again," she muttered. Colonel Reyes, no longer just Ruktu, now officially her instructor, looked at her carefully. "You know your mother bounced her first landings too?" She glanced at him. She did. More than she'd ever admit, he said with a small smile. "Great pilots aren't born. They're built." Lia nodded slowly. Emergency courage had saved lives. But discipline would build her future. Months turned into years. She logged hours. Studied aerodynamics. Learned weather systems. Mastered navigation. She stopped being the miracle girl and became something better. A hard-working pilot in training. The media attention faded. The headlines moved on. But the people from Flight 217 didn't forget. Every so often, letters arrived. Photos of families. Handwritten notes. "You saved my daughter's life. My son wants to be a pilot because of you." One envelope held a simple drawing from a 7-year-old boy, a stick figure flying a big airplane with the words, "Thank you for not letting us fall." Lia kept that one on her desk. At 16, she stood once again at the Air Force Memorial. This time, she wasn't alone. Colonel Reyes stood beside her. General officers stood behind her. And gathered near the base of the spires were pilots who once flew with Lia Carter. They had added something new to the memorial plaque. It now read. In her final act, Captain Lia Carter saved her daughter. Her legacy lives on in the sky. Lia traced her mother's name again. But this time, she didn't feel small. She felt ready. The general stepped forward, holding a familiar patch. Black. Silver thread. Ghost Rider. We retired this call sign out of respect, he said. But legacies aren't meant to end. They're meant to continue. He extended the patch. This belongs to you, when you choose to carry it. Lia took it carefully. I won't wear it until I earn it, she said. The general smiled. That's exactly why you will. 2 years later, on a clear morning at Nellis Air Force Base, Lia stood in front of an F-22 Raptor. The same aircraft her mother had once flown. The engines were silent for now. The aircraft looked almost alive in the sunlight. Without thinking, she stepped forward and placed her hand gently on the wing. Fly safe, she whispered. Come home. Then she traced a small infinity symbol in the air. Colonel Reyes watched quietly. She used to do that, he said. I know, Lia replied. She climbed into the back seat for her first familiarization flight. Not in control. Not yet. But in the air. The canopy closed. The engines ignited with a scream of power that vibrated through her bones. The aircraft accelerated. The runway blurred. And then. They were airborne. At 40,000 feet, the world curved gently below. The sky above deepened into a darker blue. Feels different from a 777, doesn't it? Reyes' voice came through the headset. She laughed softly. Just a little. How does it feel? She looked out across the endless horizon. The same horizon her mother once loved. The same sky that nearly took everything from her. Like I'm home, she answered. They didn't perform combat maneuvers. Just smooth, controlled flight. Pure aviation. When they landed, a small group waited. Pilots. Veterans. A few quiet reporters. One asked her the same question the world had been asking for years. You were declared dead once. You landed a passenger jet at 11. Now you're flying fighters. What would you say to someone facing something impossible? She thought back to that aisle at 39,000 feet. The click of her seatbelt. The moment she stood up. I'd say impossible is just a word people use when they're scared, she replied calmly. Most of the time, it's not impossible. It's just necessary. She looked up at the sky one more time. Her story had started with tragedy. With secrecy. With fear. But it continued with discipline. With courage. With purpose. Colonel Reyes stepped beside her. 2 more years until the academy, he said. She nodded. It's a long road. Worth it? She smiled. Mom spent 10,000 hours becoming Ghost Rider, she said. I can spend 10,000 hours becoming whoever I'm meant to be. The sun dipped lower behind the runway. The sky glowed gold. Some legacies are carved in stone. Others are written in clouds. And somewhere high above, in the open endless blue, Ghost Rider wasn't just a memory anymore. She was flying again.